Swinehart, though thou knewest all this. He just gave him a review. You knew everything about your grandfather. You knew everything. And still, you're disobeying God here. Nebuchadnezzar had come to the knowledge of God. Look at two verses here. Verse 34 in the previous chapter. It says, At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever. Drop down to verse 37, that same chapter. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol thee, and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. So he'd come to knowledge of God. If somebody wants to argue whether they're saved or not, I'm not going to get into that. But he come to the knowledge where he recognized the God that Daniel worshiped was a living and true God, it looks like to me. And so Belshazzar here, he knew about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And so one of the dreams he had back in Daniel chapter 2 had to do with the rise and fall of the other kingdoms. All right. He had this big statue that I dream about. And on the top was the head of gold. And what did that represent? Anybody remember? Head of gold represented what kingdom? Nebuchadnezzar. Then we come down to the silver with the Medo and Persian. We had the two arms. This represented the Medo Persian. There's the ones that's outside now going to take over. And then we have Greece, which has to do with the belly and the thighs. That's made out of brass. And then we come to the iron, which is the legs. Okay. And then, of course, the 10-toed kingdom, which is when Christ comes back. So what is he doing here? When he's defying God, he's defying the enemy that's outside now. He is defying. Think about this now. It's all been prophesied how these kingdoms are going to go. Nebuchadnezzar is the first king, then the Medo-Persian. He is defying the prophetic word of God. It's like he's saying, I know what God has said. I know what's been prophesied. This isn't going to happen. But you know what? God is going to show him who is sovereign. And Nebuchadnezzar had acknowledged that God was sovereign. And so Belshazzar here makes his toast to his false gods, and in their sin they cloak it as an act of worship in the same. And so they veil their blasphemy, we might say, in the name of religion. It's like Belshazzar saying himself as sovereign. He's sovereign in his arrogance. Nothing's going to happen. And he thinks he's secure against the will of God. That's what he thinks. But now something happens. The writing on the wall. Look at the first verses 5 through verse 9. In the same hour that he's blaspheming God, drinking from these things, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and went over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that moved. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loose, and his knees smote one against the other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing, and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now just imagine this. Let's say we're living way back a long time ago. We have no electric lights. We have no movie screens. We have no computers. We have nothing where we can see anything at all. We can't take pictures. We can't do any of that type of stuff. What do you suppose our reaction would be if we saw the fingers writing on the wall? See, they had nothing like this. If they had light, it was through torches or something like that. And this is something entirely new. Now today, if we looked at it, we say, well, there's some way to explain that. We all have computers and all the other things, and they explain that away, but they can't do that. So we see the king's reaction here, verses 5 through 9. The finger writes on the wall, And it says it's by a candlestick there, which means it's by a light. It's by maybe some kind of a torch or something there. And so it's visible here for everybody to see. Not only does the king see it, but everybody else is there. They see it also. So God is dealing very directly with Belshazzar here in judgment. We read in the New Testament about an individual, John chapter 8. He wrote something on the ground. You remember the story? That was in mercy. Here, God is dealing with Belshazzar in judgment. Jesus was dealing with mercy there with the women taking adultery. But the writing remains on the wall now, so it can be studied. And so we see a great fear now with the king there in verse 6. Just try to imagine what this might have been like. Probably couldn't stand. His face got all flushed here, panicky. His strength, it says his bones are all loose. I don't know if he's shaking all over or what, And it says his knees knocked together. Undoubtedly choked on his drink. He's terrified. Everybody else is terrified. They've seen this finger coming right on the wall. And so in verse 7, he promises some kind of a fortune to anybody that can interpret that, tell the meaning of that. And so it's a threefold reward. What's the first thing that's going to happen to them if they were able to interpret that? As we look there in verse number 7, what's the first thing they're going to reward this individual with? Scarlet robe or purple, whatever it is. Some people say it should be purple. The Bible says it's scarlet here. What's the next thing? And this has to do with royalty. What's the next thing that's going to happen? Going to get a gold chain. And what's the next thing? All right. What ruler is he going to be? Now, why do you suppose he said third? Because Belshazzar and his dad are co-kings. So Belshazzar is really number 2, and Nabonidus, he's number 1, but he's away. He spent a lot of time away for some reason and just left Belshazzar inside. And so there were co-rulers. So he's very correct when he says, you'll be the third ruler. So it's a generous offer. But it seems to me it wouldn't really mean anything because he doesn't know it, but the kingdom's going to be destroyed that night. So he calls all his wise men there, and we see the failure of the wise men there in verse number 8. And nobody knows why Daniel wasn't with them. It's been suggested that maybe through the change of command of the kings and the rulers and everything, maybe he got demoted because of the administration. Whatever the reason, we find all these pagans, they couldn't do it. They couldn't interpret what was going on. And so we see the frustration of all the leaders there in verse number 9. It says, was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changing, and his lords or the people were all there. They're terrified. A sudden change had taken place. Now, I wonder what's going on through Belshazzar's mind. He undoubtedly knows at this time he has defied God, not only enemies outside. I wonder if something's going through his mind now, if there's a connection through what he has been doing, defying God, breaking all these vessels, praising the false gods, and now he sees all this writing on the wall. I don't know, just a thought. But then something happens. A report comes about Daniel. There's information about him in verses 10 through 12. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. So she came in. She wasn't there. So this queen is believed to be the queen mother, which probably was Nebuchadnezzar's wife, which means this would be Belshazzar's grandmother. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father or grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father or grandfather, the king, I say, thy father made master of the magicians, astrologers, and Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Now, the word father there is the same kind of reference as we'd say that David was the father of Jesus. It carries that kind of connotation with it, so it could be grandfather there. Verse number 12, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So there's information about Daniel, the queen. She comes, and she knew Daniel, and she has a great deal of respect for him. Verse 12 says he has an excellent spirit in him. And of course, I don't know if she realized it, but the excellent spirit came from God. And then it says in verse 11, he was made master of all the other supposedly people that could do these things. And so Daniel is called, and then there's an interrogation with Daniel starting in verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. He speaks about Daniel's God as many gods there in verse 14. He doesn't accept what Nebuchadnezzar did. Then in verse 13, he refers to Daniel's Jewish background. He was the tribe of Judah, and these vessels that these vessels in Daniel had been taken from Jerusalem at the same time. When Jerusalem was destroyed and Daniel was captured, these vessels were also taken. So he admits here in verse 15 that his pagan gods and his advisors had failed. And so he offers a reward now to Daniel, the same thing he offered to anybody that could interpret this. He's offering it to Daniel. Now, Daniel refuses the reward. We see in verse 17, Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. Now, the first thing I want us to notice is Daniel said he's going to interpret it. He'll tell the meaning of it. But what does he do? He refuses the reward. Now, why do you suppose Daniel refused the reward that the king has offered to him? It's the same thing he offered to everybody else. Why might he refuse that reward? Any comment? He might have known destruction was coming. As he walked in and saw the king, he might have already seen the writing on the wall and knew what it meant, but he hadn't said anything to the king yet. Anything else? Well, yeah, a long time ago. So he doesn't want to have what the king has and enjoy it. It is good. I don't think he wanted to feel, you can come up with almost anything, but he certainly didn't want to feel indebted to the king. Now the king has given me the stuff, now I got to do this. Well, he doesn't want to feel that way. He said he's going to interpret it without the reward. And so he said he'd go ahead and he explained the writing. And also, if he would have received the reward, somebody might have said that he's showing bias when he interprets it. Well, the king rewarded you, and that's why you're saying all that. So he doesn't want to have anything that's holding over him where somebody's going to say that. And then he reminds him of Nebuchadnezzar here, and starting with verse 17, he says here, Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known unto him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God, gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty, and glory, and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew. Whom he would, he kept alive. And whom he would, he set up. And whom he would, he put down. Now, who's he talking about here? Who's he talking about in this verse? It might have to go back to He says, O Lord King, the Most High God, in verse 18, he said, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, who did? Most High God, thy father a kingdom and a majesty and glory and honor. So he's just continuing on there. So in verse 19, who gave all this to Nebuchadnezzar? God did. So he says, you know all about that. Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. That's the 7 years he acted like a beast. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like unto the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of the heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled. See, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thy heart, though thou knewest all this. So he refuses the reward. Then it reminds him of Nebuchadnezzar here. And he says Nebuchadnezzar also had trouble with pride there in verse number 20, and God humbled him. Now, think about this. He's calling Belshazzar to remember something that has happened in the past. What happened in the past to his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar? Side note, God calls on his people to remember his dealings in the past. Right? That's something I think our nation needs to do. Go with me back to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8, talking about how we need to remember things in the past. And then we're going to look at another verse in the New Testament. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Look at verse number 2. And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. Go down to verse 11. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes that I command thee this day. Verse 18. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. Then go to verse 19. And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God, if you forget him, and walk after other gods, and serve them and worship them, what's going to happen? I testify against you this day that ye shall surely perish. Now, if somebody comes along and says, well, that's all Old Testament. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I want to look at verse number 11. Paul's writing here. He's referring to Israel. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. Now all these things happen unto them, back in the Old Testament, for examples, and they are written for our admonition, yours and mine, upon whom the ends of the world are come. So the Old Testament's for us too, what God says back there. And he says these are written for examples. And another verse, which is almost exactly the same thing as Romans chapter 15, verse number 4, says almost the same thing. So here, back to Daniel now. In verse 21, he tells why Belshazzar is king. Why is Belshazzar king? Did I read verse 21? Oh, well, I'll read it. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. Yeah, I did. For him with grass in his body. God ruled in the kingdom, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. That last phrase, he appointed over it whomsoever he will. So he's telling Belshazzar here that you're king because God made you that. And so he in his pride is defying God. And the same thing is almost said back here in chapter 2, verse 21. about Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 21, talking about God, he changes the times and the seasons, he removeth kings and setteth up kings. Now in verses 22 through 23, he rebukes Belshazzar. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. See, he knew everything. But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which you see not. This is what his gods do now. They see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and who those are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. He hadn't humbled himself before God, had he? He deliberately lifted himself up against God. Now, how about us? Have we humbled ourselves before God? The thing about humility sometimes, most of the time, is when you think you got it, you don't have it. But what we are or what we aren't, in God's eyes, I believe, has to do with our humility. We're either humble before God or we're not. And I believe God looks upon our humility and he sees our humility, and he helps us along the way here. So Belshazzar here had deliberately lifted himself up against God by what he had just done. What he had just done, he had taken the holy vessels, and then they praised his false gods as they drank from them. So he had also not profited from his grandfather's experience. And we as Christians, we can always profit from someone else's experience. They don't necessarily have to be older than us. They could be younger. I've talked to younger people, and sometimes, wow, I never saw that. And here I've been in preacher for years, and here's a young person comes out with this thought, man, I never saw that. And we can learn. Someone said, every man is my teacher. And we all realize that. Every man can be our teacher. And Daniel referred to the idols as they just can't hear, they can't speak, they can't see, they can't do anything in verse 23. And so Belshazzar had sinned knowingly. What does Hebrews 10:26 say? For if we sin willfully after that we have received the knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sins. He knew the truth. He disobeyed God, willingly disobeyed God. So now we have the message come on the wall, the details of the interpretation. Starting with verse 24, then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. They're the ones that's just outside the wall. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, and being about 62 years old. Now, when it comes to the interpretation of these are Aramaic words, and the word mene is translated number, and it's repeated here for emphasis. We have a common colloquialism that we might say, your number's up. And this is an accurate idea that we find in Psalms chapter 90, verse 12. So teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Only God knows when our number's up. Does he not? You've heard this saying, and I'm a little bit skeptical about it, but when your number's up and nothing to do about it. But I'm not going out here and commit suicide. I'm going to pull myself in front of a train. So I don't know where God, and maybe he doesn't, Sometimes the accidents happen, and God allows it, but sometimes I have trouble understanding all that, because we do have accidents. When I was in Bible college, there was a preacher in a local town, had a good work going, and on the way home from visiting some in the hospital, he was found the truck, a piece of metal fell off the truck, went through the windshield, hit him in the head, and killed him. And a lot of the preachers at the college knew him, and I remember one instructor saying this, so it stuck with me. And everybody says, well, I wonder why God did, why did he allow that? And he just said it was simply an accident. And I don't know where God interferes and not doesn't interfere with accidents. I don't know. But we know that certainly God saw it. But we won't get into that discussion. All right. Tekel here means wait. And so God had weighed Belshazzar and his kingdom and found them lacking and deficient in moral standing. In other words, he just didn't come up to God's standards. Okay? And then Peres, which is a single form of Bepharson, means division or broken. So the kingdom was to fall and be given to the Medes and the Persians. They were just outside the wall. Concerning the image in Daniel 2, this would be the part which is silver and has two arms. The head of gold is going to be removed just like it was prophesied. And then we find out Daniel is decorated here in verse 29. So now Daniel, as he made the interpretation, he accepts the reward. Why does he accept the reward now? He wouldn't accept it before. Why does he accept it now? Could be what Brother Dean said. He knew it was going to end that night, so it didn't make any difference. Also, at this time, he'd already interpreted the message, so he feels no obligation to the king. There's no way anybody's going to say now he is showing favoritism. So he'd interpret it. So the king thought he would last for quite a while. He just puts it on him. He's going to continue on. Then in verse 30, we have the death of the king, the prophecy about the golden head, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom falling, took place that night, and they may have been marching underneath the wall right at that time. As the river was diverted, they could have been marching under the wall right then. So then we have the downfall of the kingdom in verse 31. Darius was a Median general under Cyrus the Persian. And how old was he here? 62 years old. How many is that? He wasn't a young guy, was he? Well, back then we could consider him a senior citizen, couldn't we? So people didn't live very long back then. But anyhow, we need to be careful about defying God. We as believers need to be careful about that. Hebrews chapter 12 talks about chastisement that comes to God's children when they openly defy God. Just like we would chastise our kids, our children, God chastises his children. So willful, deliberate sin is disobeying God. And if we don't get in our relationship where it ought to be with God and confess it, we can be chastised for it. God wants us to humbly submit to him and recognize him in all things. And we need to do that. I trust that we learned something today from the book of Daniel and how God deals with people. Shall we pray? Father, we thank you for your goodness to us, for the lessons we have here in the book of Daniel and Belshazzar, how he defied you, and you brought judgment upon him. Lord, help us to live a life that will be pleasing to you. Help us to be humble before you in all things.